Well, I'm going to start out. I'm going to share my screen. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. And this is the February meeting of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. We appreciate your being with us today. We don't have a formal program. We're going to make it a little bit more of a update and working meeting in some of the discussions we've been having lately, and events that are taking place basically are really putting a lot of things in front of us and a lot of opportunities. So we are the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. I don't know if there's anyone who's joining us for the first time, but here is our contact information, our website, our email address. We have Facebook and Twitter, and then generally we meet on the third Thursday of the month at 8:00 a.m. via Zoom right now. Zoom is a big advantage for us because we have a wide geographic distribution of people, and so makes it easy for people in St. Croix County or Eau Claire County or elsewhere to join us each day. So we appreciate your being with us. If you do go to our website, you will see that there is a green join button in the upper right corner, I think it is, yes. And if you are not a member, I encourage you to join if you'd like. You don't have to be a member to participate in these things. And if you've been a member, we actually suspended dues for about a year during the pandemic, and we have reinstated that. So if you'd like to continue or join, it is very economical. It's just $10 a year. So I want to go through a few things here. When we talk about West Central Wisconsin, where our coalition really is the communities on the corridor between Eau Claire and Chippewa counties to the St. Croix River. So what we generally refer to as the Chippewa Valley and the St. Croix Valley when we talk about the economic reach. And we've been around for a while. And our mission is to provide leadership and coordination to develop passenger rail service through our region as part of a strategy to ensure balanced transportation for long-term sustainable growth. And the origins of the coalition came primarily from the business and education communities in our area. A little bit on how we're organized. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We had an annual meeting in January, and we did elect our directors. We have a board of 9 people, and Jackie Pavelski, Mark Quam, and Scott Rogers were elected as 3-year terms. And then we added Ann Schell to our board to fill out an unexpired term from a resignation. And then we had our board of directors meeting earlier this month and elected our officers for the year. I was reelected chair. Our new vice chair is Jack Halbleib, who actually couldn't be with us this morning. He succeeds Bill Anderson, who is. And Bill, we appreciate the service you put in as vice chair and all the work that you've done. And I know Bill plans to continue being active. And then our secretary treasurer, Mark Quam, was reelected. Also on our board, we have Steve Yan from Momentum West, ex officio, and Eric Anderson, who is our MPO director and is with West Central Regional Planning Commission. So that's a little bit about our organization. And I just wanted to let you know that if you want to go back and see any of our previous meetings, particularly the last 2, at our January meeting, we did go through the priorities of the coalition, which we'll talk about some today. But that video is available on YouTube at our website. And we had a Run Rao from Wisconsin DOT talking about the state's programs. So that's a very good meeting. And then at our December meeting, we did have Derek James from Amtrak. So those I would commend to you if you are interested in going back and looking at some of that information. So today we really are planning to have kind of a working meeting. I'm going to go through our priorities and give kind of an update and talk about what's going on, and then open the floor up to any comments or concerns or questions that people have as we're going forward. So we covered some of this last time, but we also want to reiterate it and make sure that we are literally on the right track, and pun intended. And we generally have seen these are some of the things we've been working for our region. One is frequent regional service, Eau Claire to the Twin Cities. Another is being part of a through service from Chicago and Milwaukee to the Twin Cities. TCMC here refers to Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago, which is the terminology that the Minnesota and Wisconsin DOTs have been using when they talk about the corridor. There are plans for more frequencies. There's going to be another train added in the near future to the current route. And they are already talking about more frequencies. And then you have things like the Federal Railroad Administration Midwest Plan that was released last fall that shows Chicago to the Twin Cities as one of the top corridors for development. The IIJA is the acronym for the bipartisan infrastructure bill that includes significant framework for development of corridors and perhaps just as importantly, significant funding. So that'll be some things that we'll be looking at. And then another is to look at transit and also throughway shuttle connections from our corridor to existing Amtrak stations as an interim step, as well as additional frequencies once we have actual service. And WSDOT has specifically talked about including a shuttle from the Chippewa Valley to Toma as part of the additional train TCMC implementation coming up in the near future. So once again, these are the route we're talking about, concentrating on Eau Claire, Menominee, Baldwin, Hudson River Falls, possible stop in Stillwater using the Union Pacific tracks to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And we talk about those different priorities. They have already been identified in some state rail plans. The Minnesota rail plan includes a Twin Cities to Eau Claire corridor as part of their phase 1 system. One of the iterations of that included a technical report looking at 4 frequencies a day on the route. And then Wisconsin's state rail plan does show service through Eau Claire, Menominee, and Hudson as a future connection. We'll talk about this in just a minute. The state rail plan is going to be updated, and we are expecting a draft of that fairly soon that'll be open for comment. And my understanding is it will be much more detailed and specific in terms of what future routes might be, ridership, those sorts of things from the discussions we've had with WSDOT. Other things that we've seen, this is the visionary map that Amtrak put out recently in response to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, saying the blue lines on this map are expansions or additional services that they would be interested in pursuing as the corridor is identified. Here's more of a close-up of the upper Midwest, and you can see Madison, Green Bay, and a additional Twin Cities route through our region is included. And they actually have a spot on their website where they go into more detail about things like the populations and the universities on the line, that sort of thing. And then we've talked in the past about the FRA Midwest Regional Rail Network. This report came out last fall. It's a long range, but framework for future corridor rail development. And presumably the fact that the FRA released this means that this will have some bearing on the priorities for future funding as communities and states pursue that. And then finally, I did mention that WSDOT has talked about corridor or shuttle connections, including perhaps Eau Claire and or Menominee to Toma as part of the second train implementation. And Arun even showed us this potential schedule where if you had shuttles both to the existing Empire Builder service as well as the second train, this is what the schedules might look like. And then as we've pursued all of this over the last few years, we've tried to look around and see what kind of innovations we could apply here, such as development around stations that can help make services successful and perhaps even provide funding streams. The success communities like Normal, Illinois have had, small cities with investments in service and rail stations, and then looking at how some of those initiatives have been organized with commissions or authorities operating or pursuing passenger rail service in different regions. So that's a little bit of background. And at the risk of sounding like a monologue, I'm going to go through a few things in terms of priorities to get to move forward all three of those things. One of them is finalizing the organization of the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission and developing a work plan to support passenger rail connections to our region. And that includes in the resolutions that were passed by the 3 counties and 6 municipalities, the activities would be looking at things like what are the roles of local governments, bi-state cooperation with the Minnesota entities in Washington and Ramsey counties, as well as the Minnesota DOT and others. So that is an important step, the public side of a public-private partnership going forward. I'm going to advance the slide just a second and show that we had, as I mentioned, Eau Claire, Dunn, and St. Croix counties and the cities of Hudson, New Richmond, Baldwin, Menominee, Eau Claire, and Altoona all passed resolutions to become part of that commission. This is the list of counties. The commission does have a meeting scheduled now. It will be on Wednesday, March 2nd at 3:30. The primary task is going to be to continue to finalize the organization, to talk a little bit about its activities. I believe Arun is going to be a guest speaker there, and we'll be looking at what kind of work going forward. Jim Dunning, who I think is on the call this morning, is an Eau Claire County supervisor. He is the Eau Claire County designee to that commission and is currently serving as the temporary chair. And Eau Claire County has been gracious enough to help with the administration of that commission. So I just want to go back real quick to other priorities. One is to continue to explore public-private partnership options for the corridor, including things like value capture, which is what I talked about in terms of taking advantage of the economic activity around the station sites. Working with WISDOT, MnDOT, and others as the FRA begins its corridor identification program, and then participation and feedback on the state rail plan as it progresses. So those are some activities that are important for us to be watching for. Some of those are awaiting activity from, say, WISDOT to release that state rail plan. One thing that was just, we were just alerted to by the High Speed Rail Alliance. Rick Harnish, their director, has spoken with us a couple times. The FRA did put out a request for public comment on the corridor identification program that ends on March 9th. So we're just learning about this, what it entails. I have talked to some other groups and other experts in transportation to see what kind of comments we might want to make so that we can be part of the, we can submit appropriate comments and they can help us advance our priorities here in the region. I have some other priorities I want to mention, but I did want to perhaps stop for a minute and see if anybody has any comments or questions so far. All right. I'm going to continue to go through those priorities and then perhaps we can have a discussion. Some of these get real specific and would be next steps if we can see initiatives pursued, such as the state rail plan or facilitating a public-private partnership, et cetera. There is going to need to be some work on things like ridership and track and operating studies. We do know that the state is planning to look in more detail through the state rail plan and other things at expansion of the Chicago to Twin Cities corridor. And so we hope to be involved in that and make sure some of these things happen and that they can benefit our short haul regional corridor as well. We do know that St. Paul isn't the only goal as far as serving the Twin Cities, and having services go directly to Minneapolis is important. So we want to be aware of that. And we also know that there's a junction on the east side of St. Paul just before Union Depot that is a choke point and needs some improvements if we're going to have frequent passenger rail service. So we're going to want to stay on top of that. Among other things, the shuttles to Toma, exploring funding options and complementary ridership sources. So one of the things we have talked about in the past is states like California have been very successful in running shuttles to offline cities that connect with their passenger rail program. I did have a call recently with a run and with the transit manager from WSDOT, and there are some other possible funding sources as well that perhaps even get this started sooner than TCMC. For instance, there is a VA hospital in Toma. If we had a shuttle going to Toma every day, it might be worth exploring whether that would be a source of ridership and a benefit to veterans in the community, as well as there is some transit funding, intercity bus funding that might be available, and we will want to pursue some of that. We also want to look at developing economic impact analysis to show the value of our investments. And then in some of our board meetings, people like Jeff Abbott, who is a former WSDOT transportation official, has talked about some of the things we need to make sure happen too in terms of addressing corridor protection and safety issues. We also, as a coalition, as we do more, want to update and enhance our communication and membership efforts, keeping people involved, keeping them informed, informing the public. And we've been privileged to have Dan Schillinger join us recently and become active. Dan, I think, is on the call today too, and he is the former news director at Channel 18 here in Eau Claire and has taken an interest in our project and is helping us out with the website and some of the other communications. We also want to inform policymakers on the benefits of passenger rail, how they can advance its implementation on the state level, and we have not really had a need to involve legislators, but coming next budget year and potential matches for federal funding, there may be a role for state government. And then, of course, we've been very pleased to have our local counties and municipalities have a high interest in this, but maintaining our and enhancing our relationships with county board members and city council members, towns and others is going to be important. And then there are a lot of groups that are have similar goals that we do, allied groups, other transit and rail advocates, but also those who are concerned about transportation for seniors, those with disabilities, access for colleges and universities. And we have a lot of those contacts already, but we want to enhance that and make sure we're doing everything we can going forward. So I did want to mention some things that this moves us really to what do we do next and how do we put things together. We had some discussion of this at our most recent board meeting, and we wanted to open it up for more comments. So based on the comments we had at the board meeting and things we'd like to hear from some of you about, some of the things we need to look at are, as the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission gets going, what is its role and what is the role of an advocacy group like the Rail Coalition? What can we do? What should we have them take the lead on? And then as we look at our own efforts, we may need to get back to having some committees or task groups that work on specific things. And I just made a quick list of those, and they might be organized differently, but some of these have come up. Some of these specific people have said that they're interested in being involved in. One would be communications. Another would be specifically pursuing the public-private partnerships and talking with service providers and organizations. Another would be transportation planning, funding, corridor protection. We're fortunate to have some current and past and retired transportation professionals have taken a special interest in our project here, and some of those people I think we can call upon to help us out in that area. Legislative relations, making sure that we're talking to our elected officials and having relationships with them, keeping them informed and calling upon them when we need some help. Working on things like the shuttle and transit connections, and then working with allied groups, making sure we're staying in touch with and working together with others who share some of our goals. I will give you a quick update on the public-private partnerships too. We actually have been contacted by a couple different groups about working with them. So Amtrak, of course, is a possibility. We do know that we have a good relationship with the Union Pacific Railroad. They are also interested in whether non-Amtrak entities like one of the service providers who does commuter rail implementation. And just within the last few days, we've had meetings with, there's a trade association called AI Pro, which is the organization of the private contractors who operate many commuter services. They are very interested in competing for intercity passenger rail programs. They don't necessarily take market risk, but they are interested in helping facilitate services. One of them is a company called Herzog. They approached us. We've had a couple meetings with them. They operate something like 15 rail passenger services in the country and a couple streetcars. Their total ridership is actually larger than Amtrak, so they're a very solid organization. There are a couple other companies who do similar things, and we had a meeting with their trade association just this week and are pursuing what we can do to look at that. There's also another entity based in Milwaukee that's doing some transit-oriented development that has some interest in cooperating with us, and because we're in the same state, et cetera, and looking at how we can work together. So we'll be looking for some other help with that. And we've had a couple of our members step forward and say they want to work in that area as well. So before I open it up, I just wanted to put email addresses up there too. So if you don't get a chance to say anything here, but you're interested in being involved in any one of these areas, I would certainly like to hear from you and see what your thoughts are. But right now, I'm just going to open up the floor because I've done a lot of talking, and I apologize for that, and see if anybody has any comments or questions or suggestions. Yeah, Jackie.
I'm unmuting myself. Yeah, I just want to follow up a little bit because, you know, at our last board meeting, we listed those, the entire list of priorities, which some fit into these categories. I'm just curious, you will continue with that, because another thing that I'm thinking too, that Federal Register is a really important document to have filled, because it really starts the thought about funding and how to. And I will say, with my experience with that Federal Register in the area of healthcare particularly, I mean, that one is the key document here where you're going to be defining. And so I just want to mention the importance. And I do think one of the real things you want to capture is the participation and feedback of the state rail plan. Also, that public involvement section is really important for them to be hearing all of that. So Scott, I'm just tossing that one out just to make sure that it's covered in a great way. I don't know how you plan to do that, but it's important.
Yeah, specifically, we actually had a meeting with AI Pro yesterday, and Jack Hallbleib, our vice chair, was there, and Eric Anderson, our MPO director.
Okay.
And I think Jim was going to try to attend, but he couldn't make it. And they are working on some comments as well, and we're going to give us some suggestions. And then I was going to be in touch with Rick Harnish, who initially brought this up, so that we want to make sure that the Midwest and our kinds of services are identified in that corridor identification program. We need to really look at what this is about. I think it's not a request for what routes, it's a request for, they're saying, here's the process we're going to undertake. What do you think about our process?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that one. So, yeah.
The other thing I did not mention is that so there's also, in previous meetings, we've talked about the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, which is the successor to the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative that several Midwest states started in the 90s. It's a formal commission with 8 states, with members of the commission. Well, the commission was created through legislative action of each of those states, and then the members are appointed by the governor and legislatures of each state. A couple things about the IIJA. One is that it specifically calls out interstate commissions as getting some priority for federal funding and work and identification. And the MIPRC just entered into a contract with Quandel, one of the major consulting firms, to submit an application to FRA to take the state rail plans and the FRA's Midwest plan and to, I guess you might say, put some legs on those things to actually look at more detail about what routes could be developed, what some of the priorities might be, what the ridership might be. So it's not actually the study they're undertaking an application to see if they can get funding from FRA to do that study and then submit that as part of the corridor identification program. So I'm actually one of the commissioners, and we'll certainly be making sure. And of course, we are in both the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin rail plans. So by definition, we would be looked at in that. So
yeah.
Thanks, Jackie.
You bet.
Just to answer your question about the FRA then, so I'm getting some input, and I would perceive that we would draft some comments and then I would circulate it with the board. The board doesn't meet until March 15th, but I would circulate it with the board to get some approval. And I think we would probably bring it up at the Chippewa St. Croix Rail Commission meeting, ask them perhaps to submit some comments as well.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah. Others have comments, or you want to raise your hand to volunteer for anything? Or?
Oh, I'll volunteer for something,
Okay.
but I'll write you an email.
Thank you. Are we on the right track? Pun intended.
Hey, Scott, it's Tom Lindfors.
Yeah. Hi, Tom.
Hey, I guess 30,000 foot elevation. Do you guys know how much this would cost to do the specific spur from Eau Claire to the Twin Cities? Is there a number for that? And then my second question is, with these independent operators, how capable are they? Could they do a turnkey here where they would, do the work essentially? We said build it, run it, etc. That's my questions.
Yeah. The cost part, we don't know. That's some of the studies we have to look at. One of the benefits that already exists is that the Union Pacific has put some substantial investment in this line in terms of the track condition. It also has what's called PTC, which is a signaling system that you need for frequent passenger operation. And then you need equipment, that sort of thing. So would be yet to come, but if you look at other potential routes where they might have a 25-mile-an-hour branch line, or Rochester to the Twin Cities where there's no track at all and you'd have to build a whole new line, we actually are very far ahead of the game and have a corridor that could probably be implemented relatively quickly. I know Dave Christensen's been really involved in this. I don't know if I should put you on the spot as a former MnDOT transportation planner. If you have, I need to answer Tom's question I'll come back to Tom's question about turnkey. Do you have any other thoughts on costs? It's kind of early to guess at that. And you're muted, by the way. Dave, you're muted. Let's see if you can unmute.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, when we were moving into study phases of this project in the last 2 years, we had come to an agreement with Union Pacific that we would do a feasibility and engineering study for the cost of about $250,000 with one of their consultants in charge. And once that study was done, they would sign off on it and accept the results of that study as a means to move ahead for engineering improvements on the line that would make it passenger compatible. The other thing that we had agreed with Union Pacific is that they would work the cost of improvements into essentially a long-term lease. So we would be paying on an as-you-go basis for improvements on the line. We also had found suppliers at the time that would supply motive power and passenger equipment again, on a lease basis. That has since gone by the by, but there are other opportunities that would probably allow us to do that. So we actually had found a path that would allow us to activate passenger service on the line in a short amount of time, probably 18 to 24 months, and with little or no upfront expenditure. Cities, of course, be responsible for the station sites. But that is where we were up until about 6 months ago. So we'd come a long way to doing that, if that answers your questions, Tom. Unlike a lot of places where we'd have to invest several millions, if not tens of millions of dollars into upgrades and construction, we had found a fairly low-cost way of moving ahead with this project.
Is that something that it sounds almost like it could be operated as certainly a private sort of operation? Is the thing that would slow something like that down having to meet federal regulations or state regulations, or is that something that would happen simultaneously with that? It sounds like from your description, you were right on the doorstep of getting this thing done.
In a lot of ways we were. That's how we had designed it from the start, to go private and do it with little or no public investment. With the opportunities that we have in front of us now with the Infrastructure Investment Act and Amtrak's expansion, as well as the US DOT's expansion opportunities, we might want to look at a public option. And that's why we've got the Chippewa Valley St. Croix Commission coming together. That, of course, would slow us down somewhat just because of bureaucratic issues and grant applications and everything else. But as far as meeting requirements on the federal side for actually operating, we probably have answered most of those questions.
So Tom, I'm going to take you from 30,000 to 50,000 feet too.
Thank you.
One of the challenges, we have a transportation system where most modes are heavily subsidized. For instance, gas taxes pay something like 50% of the cost of providing streets and roads and highways. And so anytime you're going to say, I'm going to be a private organization, I'm going to try to compete with that. That's very hard to do. But there are some ways, because of the inherent efficiency of passenger rail service and so forth, that it's a very good investment, and you can come very close to covering all your costs, or sometimes cover all of them. And that's where some of these innovations like transit-oriented development, value capture come in. So you probably have to have at least some public involvement, and even the private side, you see oftentimes the capital, like for airports, you have private entities running on public highways. So I'm probably opening a can of worms, but it gets complicated, but it does make it hard for a private organization. We actually are seeing some of that emerge with Brightline in Florida, and with Texas Central in Texas, where it's the combination of passenger revenues and real estate development that make it work. But as Dave said, with the infrastructure bill and the significant federal funding that's going to be available, a lot of this can be used to get this set up. And then you may get a situation where when you get it operating, there is very little and perhaps no ongoing public costs. And that would be one of our goals. The Amtrak Hiawatha service that the state of Wisconsin and state of Illinois operate between Chicago and Milwaukee, before the pandemic, it was very, very close to covering all its costs. And that's, even to open up another can of words, there's concerns about whether Amtrak is the lowest cost operator. And that's really where these other, so I'll come back way around to come back to your other question. The company, I put Herzog's website in the chat if anybody wants to look at that. So they are one of the organizations that does this sort of thing. You don't hear of them because their name doesn't appear on any of the services. They are primarily a contractor. So they're not necessarily an organization that's going to come in and say, well, we want to run this service and we're going to take the risk on it. But they are an organization that comes in and says, we're going to do a really high quality operation. We're going to operate the equipment. We're going to maintain it. We're going to run it on time. We're going to have a good relationship with the railroad. And we're going to do it very economically. And in fact, the companies that make up AI Pro compete with each other, but they also cooperate because they're looking for the private business. So if you look at Herzog, they actually had a situation recently in Connecticut where Connecticut wanted to expand service between New Haven, Hartford, and Springfield. They put it out to bid. Amtrak bid on it, Herzog bid on it, other people, and they selected Herzog to run that service, even though it was on a line that already has Amtrak service. So they see that as the kind of thing, Connecticut. So we've talked about getting in touch with Connecticut, find out how they made that decision, but those companies now see, and it's also important to note that it's FRA and the commissions in the states that are really going to make the decisions about the money. Amtrak is a potential partner, but they are not the only partner that can be worked with. They also have, these companies do have a lot of contacts. They work with equipment organizations, et cetera. So I think whether they're turnkey or not, I think they're close to that you hire them and then they run the service for you. Other services they run the streetcars in Oklahoma City and Kansas City. They do the commuter rail in New Mexico. They run I believe they run the San Francisco to San Jose Caltrain service, which was the highest ridership transit services in the country. So, and some of those contracts they won against other companies.
It seems, Scott, like, from the little that I know about this, you guys have already made the case this is economically feasible, and more than that, it's a money making, more than break even proposition. It seems also like it would be foolish to pass up on this opportunity with the amount of money out there. I get that. You can't not look at those opportunities, even though it might slow this process down a little bit. It makes sense. But those seems like a little bit, competing directions. It's sort of like it's all shuffling itself out at the moment to see what direction works best. But it does seem like you've got all the pieces in place to make this case pretty straightforward to anybody who's interested in it. It sounds like to me, maybe putting the details underneath there in order is a lot of what you laid out there in terms of priorities, but it doesn't seem like it's a much more than a common sense decision that this could work. Anyway, that's all I had.
Sometimes you have to press the case for common sense decisions and get out there and make sure gets to the attention of people who make the decision. So that's really what we're trying to do. So
yeah, comment's not so common anymore. I get that. Thanks.
Other comments or questions from people or suggestions or volunteering to be part of something?
I do have another question, if there's still room. Is there an actual mission statement and everything like that together for this? When you were mentioning about the communications part of this, for a person like me who might be a foot soldier for something like this, it would be great to have a very concise piece of material I could hand somebody or hand to a city council or a village board that, puts it together, maybe attaches to your website, but that kind of very concise. Maybe it's a matter of doing this in steps. Here's where we are right now. This is what we're working on. A year from now, here's what we're doing. That would be helpful for somebody like me.
Yeah, and we at various times we've had that, and we're in the process of revising that because of some of the changes in the direction and the new opportunities that have arisen. Dan, you might want to make a comment about communications, and we'd already done a bunch of stuff, and you've been kind of coming in and helping us shape it up to be more robust and make sure that we're getting our points across. So what thoughts do you have on what we should be doing going forward?
Well, I think, what I've been trying to do is trying to focus more on attracting more public interest in the project. Because I think the public interest tends to come and go depending on, what's in the news at the moment. So by keeping the website updated and then pushing links to the website on social media, which is where all the action is nowadays, if you want to reach the public. That's what I've been doing, is trying to keep our name out and the project out in front of the public via Facebook and Twitter, and try to get people. And that's why we started posting the videos of the meetings on the website too, so that we would have that ability to have a link where people could actually click on it and see what we're doing.
And the priorities, the priorities we just went through, something we just developed within the last 2 months as we moved on from our previous project that we work on. And basically the organization we were working with ultimately was not able to deliver what we were looking for. And so we did need to move on from that. But I know when Dave Christensen and the organizing council kicked things off a few years ago, we were really creating an opportunity. There was really nothing to hang our hats on. And now, WSDOT is more involved in passenger rail expansion. We've had this federal money become available. And it's, if you ever go to some of the webinars and other things or just the materials that talk about what's in the IIJA, it's actually multiple times, over 5 years, it's multiple times the amount of money to invest in rail expansion versus the total federal investment for the last 50 years. So it's really a game changer. So Bill Draves put a comment in the chat asking, what do the major players say about the timing of a high-speed train, Twin Cities, Chicago, with a stop in Eau Claire? And I think Bill is probably talking about, we sort of run first with what we might call conventional trains. So those are the ones that run 80 miles an hour, perhaps 90, are competitive with driving, but not necessarily faster than driving. And then of course you have the true high speed, which the closest thing we have in the US is the Northeast Corridor that gets up to 125, but around the world they have 150, 200 mile an hour high speed trains. I'll make a couple comments on that. One is that there does appear to be a lot of potential for more conventional service initially from Chicago to the Twin Cities. And there are going to be some limitations on running on the current route, especially between La Crosse and the Twin Cities, because of the river and because of the additional freight traffic that's going to materialize with the merger between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern. And so one of the reasons that we're in the state rail plan, and one of the reasons that service through Eau Claire and Menominee and Hudson River Falls is included, is that as you get up to more trains per day, you're going to need another route for them to run on, because there won't be room for them through La Crosse and Red Wing, et cetera. And this route has capacity, and the railroad is generally open to that. The FRA study looked at different service levels. If you're not familiar with the High Speed Rail Alliance, that's Rick Harnish. If you go to our website, you can see a recent, he spoke with one of our meetings last fall. They are proponents not only of conventional service, because they think that's important, but also of eventual high frequency, high speed service. They also see, as does the FRA study, a lot of potential between Chicago and the Twin Cities. The FRA study called this one an eventual core express route, which would be your true high speed rail. And given the corridors available, I think we're optimistic that the route through West Central Wisconsin for true high speed would be the most logical route and shortest and least issues with rights of way, et cetera. There is some sentiment to run it through Rochester. There you need to create new right of way, and it would be also longer. And so whether that would materialize or not, I don't know. You'll see that on some maps. So Bill, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think long-term, we're pretty optimistic about that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dave. Yeah, Bill. And then we'll go to Dave.
It seems like so far what we've done here is we've got two directions. Number one is the public direction, and it seems as though we're really concentrating on that. Tom's comments about where we were at and some of the things Dave offered with the where we were at really with the private sector involvement being the major portion of what we were looking at. If we are going to move all of our efforts to the public side, we're going to give up our relationship with Union Pacific in the process. We're going to give up our hope to have 4 round trips to the Twin Cities area. And we'll probably, if we're going to go to really spend our time focusing on the public side, we'll probably get 1 train a day going each direction here. If that's, I think we have to decide, are we going to do a 2-pronged effort? Are we going to do a single-pronged effort? And are we ready to accept one direction or the other? I think that's all I got to say for now.
Right. Thanks, Bill. I'll address that in a minute, but I know, Dave, you had your hand up. You wanted to speak.
Yeah, to address Bill's concerns, I don't think if we go public that we're going to give up the goal of having 4 frequencies a day between Twin Cities and St. Paul and conventional rail that is at or above break even. I think those are just built into the corridor. We don't have to give up anything by looking at public funding for that. The other thing that Bill Draves and others are talking about, and that you were talking about on the high-speed rail, I think it's important to point out that for the next generation high-speed rail, the FRA study itself pointed out that of all the corridors coming out of Chicago, the one to the Twin Cities is the only one that fully justifies high-speed rail up to 200 miles per hour or better on new right-of-way. You can't run that kind of train speed and frequency on freight lines. You have to build a new line. That's just a given. But that said, this corridor would be competitive with airline traffic, and the same corridor has a ridership capacity of 3 or 4 million riders a year to start. And I think we need to keep that on the horizon and in our conversations, that anytime we can promote true high speed, not only are we on the corridor, but it's one that would be extremely beneficial for Minnesota and Wisconsin and the entire Midwest. And in the FRA's mind, it is eminently doable. And it's important to note that there's only one high-speed line under construction right now in the US and actually scheduled to open. That's between Dallas, Fort Worth and Houston. Even the California high-speed rail is stumbling quite a bit. So, you know, we stand in a good place no matter which way we go. I think we need to pursue all options.
Jeff, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just a comment to cost, and Dave, you can chime in too, but there's a good base estimate that came out of the Quandel study for the TCMC through Eau Claire. Things have changed obviously since that study was concluded. Section of the UP line reopened from Wyville down to Camp Douglas, which was closed before. So a lot of things that have been improved along the line since that estimate or for a build scenario was given in the Quandel. Echoing back to Dave's comment to Bill, I agree. I don't think we're giving up a whole lot. And we were looking at 4 to 6 trips through that study to begin with on a public funding route. I don't see that being any different, and I don't see any section of this corridor being completed without some private or public dollars to begin with. So that brings in the whole issue of going through the whole bureaucratic process of getting everything cleared and ready to build. And that is the environmental process. So And with the new funding, consultants are, I don't want to say come out of the woodwork, but they're out there and they're gearing up. And they'll be approaching states, local municipalities, who's ever interested in getting something like this going. So we're going to see more of them too. But that's just my comment. So,
Bill, I do want to address your concern about whether Union Pacific is still interested, and if it were a public option. One scenario, let's say WISDOT said, we were going to consider what Connecticut did. We think the Eau Claire to Twin Cities would be a good, and with MnDOT would be a good demonstration project. We should implement a regional corridor on there, and we're going to put out an RFP to who wants to run that. And they got bids from Herzog and some of the AI Pro people and Amtrak. If they picked Herzog, Union Pacific would be happy. Union Pacific has, and we've seen in that, we're part of that, they have taken an attitude that based on reasonable negotiations, et cetera, they want to get more use out of their assets. And that's why you see things like the Rocky Mountaineer operating between Denver and Moab, Utah. That was a direct negotiation between Union Pacific and the Rocky Mountaineer. And Vic Stone, who we've been working with Union Pacific, actually worked on that project too. So I don't know if that answers your question, Bill. I think part of it is we're pursuing every avenue, and then some avenues will become more promising than others, and those will be the ones that we concentrate on.
Would Union Pacific,
Appreciate. Go ahead, Tom.
would Union Pacific rent us the big boy for a promo tour?
Maybe they brought it out here once already. So
Thank you.
Well,
I think Ann has her hand up. If you want to speak, go ahead.
okay,
Ann.
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to get back to volunteering to do things. As you know, I've tried to not volunteer for too many things since I retired. I'm being very selective, but I think based on my background, I would be willing to be involved in efforts with WISDOT and MnDOT, review reports, develop comments, that sort of thing. I don't know if I should say because that's my background, I'd rather not do it, but I guess I will say that I'd be willing to help with that.
Okay, we appreciate that. We've got about 5 minutes left. We want to respect everybody's time. So is there anybody who hasn't made a comment or a question that wanted to have a chance to speak or to volunteer or what have you?
This is Mark Quam.
Yeah, Mark.
The one question it's kind of circulating in the back of my mind with the corridor identification program, that will eventually identify key corridor routes in the US. I'm just wondering, from a cost perspective, and with the amount of money they have to work with, if they would identify this route, through Eau Claire as a potential corridor, I'm just wondering what kind of money, and again, maybe with FRA or with other funding sources, what pools of money might potentially be out there, because I often think that may affect the decision on, private investment, combination private public. And I'm just wondering at what point are we going to know when FRA or the infrastructure corridor identification program funding, et cetera, when we have some solid numbers to work with. I don't know. I mean, I know it's a hard thing to pinpoint down, but I think indirectly all those factors are all going to come to play at some point. I'm just wondering how do we prepare for that, or formulate something that's going to work in our favor, I guess.
I probably sat through 3 or 4 different webinars on the infrastructure bill, and it's hard to recall from memory all the different buckets because there's lots of them. Although that's because they're very positive, although it also means that no matter how big it is, you probably can't do everything that everybody wants to do. So the way I understand the process is going to work, and maybe this needs to be part of the comments, it's going to likely be states and commissions who then apply to the FRA for the different funding buckets. Some of it is completely open to competitive. Some of it is designated. Amtrak is getting some of it. And even some of that money could potentially be used if Amtrak were the operator for the national system. So what might come to bear is what is FRA's criteria on accepting some of those. You know, some of the positive we have is Wisconsin's been one of the most successful states at getting grants from FRA. So they kind of know the process. They're one of the first ones to get a restoration and enhancement grant. That's the initial operating subsidy, which they also sweetened a whole lot in the IIJA. It's a 6-year funding now instead of 3 years, and it starts at a higher percentage. So that helps get an operating service off the ground. And things like the MIPRC study, et cetera, might, if they do get the funding to do their study, that might be a factor in which corridors are selected. I think one comment we might end up making is that if there are opportunities for private investment or private partnerships, that might get priority. And then the other thing would be if the cost of implementing is lower. And that would certainly be something we have going for us because of the capacity on the line, the condition of the line, and even though improvements might need to be made, they're less than a lot of other potential corridors. So, you know, those might be some things, and maybe that'll become part of our comments on the process. So we'll have to see what the FRA comes out with in terms of how they're going to make those decisions. So I don't know if that helps at all, Mark, in answering your question.
Well, that kind of puts it in perspective, and it's a hard thing to, you know, pin down, but yeah, I certainly can relate to that.
Jeff and then Jackie.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of think that the NOFA, the state of Wisconsin, probably in conjunction with even Minnesota, will submit a application for funding to look at the corridors, at least within the state of Wisconsin, and hopefully revisit the TCMC corridor selection and looking at the longer term of a higher speed versus the emerging.
Jackie?
Yeah, going along with those same kind of comments, you know, I'm thinking, I did watch that webinar with Peter Schwartz, you know, regarding the FRA Midwest Regional Rail Plan. I think that's a critical document because in the end, it was talking about the Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Twin Cities corridor is the highest rated program. And that goes back to Dave's comments too, you know, whether it be high-speed rail, the corridors and et cetera, there's going to be a time where you're going to be looking at all the options that might be available and et cetera. And that's the premise, because you want to pick something that's going to be successful and meet the needs that have been identified in various plans and studies here. And I think that plan, it takes a role in terms of giving us a little direction in terms of what FRA is looking at. And I go back on my notes on what he had said. And if you can, watch that thing because it's well worth it. And that's my thought in answering your question too, Mark, as well as adding to Dave's response as well. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
All right, I see it's 9 o'clock. So any last words? Anybody wanted to make a comment that hasn't had a chance? All right, well, be glad to hear from anybody who wants to. I've actually had a couple private chats already with people who are willing to do some things. So if you're like to be involved in a particular area, let me know, or I'll send an email to me or to the general email address for the Rail Coalition. We'll keep an eye on that. And we appreciate you joining us today. All right, have a good day.